the family that transformed their own children into sustenance. The most horrific instance of incestuous relations in the state of Texas. It is a statement so grotesque it seems impossible. However, deep within the isolated backwoods of East Texas in 1967, law enforcement officials uncovered proof of exactly these kinds of atrocities. What started as a standard inquiry into a missing person evolved into one of America's most sinister historical narratives. This is a story deliberately concealed by local authorities to protect the community from the full knowledge of the horrors that occurred on the secluded Thornhill estate. Situated deep within the pine forests of Rust County, Texas, where dirt paths faded into dense woodland and neighbors lived miles apart, the Thornhill clan managed to live in seclusion for more than 4 generations. The expansive 120-acre property remained largely uncharted by strangers, safeguarded by signs warning against trespassing, ferocious canines, and the family's well-known animosity towards visitors. In adjacent towns, whispers circulated about the Thornhills, peculiar folks who never truly assimilated, who intermarried within their own bloodline, and whose offspring were seldom sent to school. For years, Sheriff Robert Calloway had listened to the gossip regarding the Thornhills, accounts of deformed children glimpsed at the boundary of the land, and stories of strange cries echoing through the woods after dark. Yet, during the late 1960s, law enforcement maintained a near-sacred respect for property rights, and lacking solid proof of misconduct, the Thornhills were simply left to themselves. This all shifted on October 12, 1967, when Eliza Mae Johnson filed a report that her 16-year-old daughter, Cordelia, had vanished. The girl was last observed accepting a ride from James Thornhill, a 45-year-old man who would sometimes come into town to peddle handmade wooden goods and crops from the family farm. Upon being questioned, James stated he had let the girl off at the highway intersection, but discrepancies in his account raised red flags for Calloway. Equipped with a search warrant, Sheriff Calloway, along with 4 deputies, made their way to the main Thornhill residence on October 15. What they uncovered would leave them haunted for the rest of their lives. The primary dwelling, a large yet run-down Victorian farmhouse, showed signs of severe filth and disregard. However, it was the root cellar located under the kitchen that unveiled the authentic terror. The smell was overwhelming. It was like a slaughterhouse abandoned to rot in the summer heat, Deputy Wallace would later recount. Within, they found human remains at differing stages of preservation. Some were suspended from hooks, similar to meat being cured. Others were kept in large barrels filled with salt. The most chilling finds were the glass containers, meticulously labeled, containing preserved organs and other human parts. Subsequent investigations uncovered that the Thornhill family, headed by Patriarch Silas Thornhill, had engaged in extreme incest for multiple generations. What originated as unions between cousins in the 1880s had, by the 1960s, transformed into something considerably more sinister. Siblings were having children together, fathers were procreating with daughters, and mothers with sons. The consequence was a family lineage that folded back on itself in biologically unfeasible patterns. The physical and mental impairments resulting from centuries of inbreeding grew progressively serious. Instead of viewing these children as casualties of their practices, the family concocted a perverted ideology. They came to see these imperfect offspring as a food supply, a method to reclaim what they deemed to be unsuccessful progeny. Throughout the initial search, investigators discovered 19 living people on the land, numerous showing clear signs of genetic abnormalities, unusual facial characteristics, stunted limbs, and cognitive difficulties. Proof pointed to the fact that those considered excessively flawed were eventually murdered and eaten by the family in a ritual they believed would fortify their lineage. As Sheriff Calloway looked over the scene of unthinkable depravity, he took a step that would later spark debate. Worried that full public knowledge would distress the community and draw morbid tourism, he classified significant portions of the probe. The official documentation would simply mention that the Thornhills were apprehended for murder and other offenses against nature. Make sure you have subscribed to this channel to get alerts when the subsequent chapter is released. The scientific examination of 4 generations of inbreeding and its disastrous outcomes will deeply shock you. The origins of the Thornhill families fall into madness and cruelty extended back to the era following the Civil War. In 1868, Jeremiah Thornhill, a Confederate veteran harboring a deep-seated hatred for governmental authority, brought his large family to the remote woodlands of East Texas. Historical documents indicate Jeremiah had already wed his first cousin, Abigail, and collectively they had 5 children. Only 3 of those survived to adulthood, each exhibiting notable intellectual deficits. Jeremiah's distrust of strangers was pathological. He prohibited his children from going to school or mingling with neighboring families. Rather, he built a self-contained universe on their secluded land, preaching a distorted version of scripture that stressed the purity of bloodlines and resistance to external corruption. Records from the county in 1878 show that Jeremiah effectively petitioned local officials to designate his land an independent homestead, exempt from particular taxes and schooling mandates, by invoking religious freedom. Jeremiah Thornhill wasn't merely eccentric, he was methodically severing his family from society, explained Dr. Margaret Leland, a historian at East Texas State University. He established the ideal environment for generational isolation and abuse to thrive without any oversight. The repercussions of this seclusion became evident in the subsequent generation. With hardly any options for marriage partners, Jeremiah's surviving children, Silas, Ruth, and Ezekiel, formed relationships among themselves. Official marriage records from the county show no documentation for these unions. Yet birth records spanning 1885 to 1895 list children born to Ruth Thornhill with no father named. Census information from 1890 indicates all 3 siblings still living on the family property with their aging parents and multiple unnamed children. By the 3rd generation, the impacts of incest grew increasingly conspicuous. Photographs retrieved from the Thornhill land depict children exhibiting traditional signs of genetic disorders, unusually narrow-set eyes, malformed limbs, and disproportionate facial structures. Medical files from a traveling physician who visited the property in 1912 noted troubling physical and mental irregularities consistent with familial intermarriage. It seems that during this 3rd generation, the family's darkest rituals commenced. According to diaries recovered from the property, Ezekiel Thornhill, who had taken over leadership after Jeremiah's death, initiated what he termed the culling. This was a procedure where children born with severe deformities or impairments would be returned to the family's strength. Forensic study of skeletal remains found buried on the land verified that some belonged to infants and young children who had significant skeletal abnormalities. By the 1920s and 1930s, the 4th generation of Thornhills had escalated this practice to an unthinkable extreme. Under the leadership of Abraham Thornhill, Ezekiel's son, the family had cultivated an elaborate belief system around consuming their imperfect children. Family texts depict this as reclaiming the strength from failed vessels and purifying the bloodline by reabsorption. The Great Depression ironically provided concealment for the Thornhills' practices. As numerous remote communities resorted to extreme measures for survival, neighbors who might have observed the disappearance of Thornhill children simply assumed the worst effects of poverty, not the reality of ritualistic cannibalism. World War II brought a short interval of external contact when 2 Thornhill men, James and Joseph, were conscripted. Military documents reveal they were rapidly discharged because of psychological unfitness and evidence of inbreeding. Regardless, their brief exposure to the external world introduced new concepts to the family compound, including modern preservation techniques that would later be utilized in the family's horrific activities. By the 1950s, the Thornhill estate had become increasingly dilapidated and secluded. Aerial images from a 1956 county survey illustrate multiple structures in varying conditions of disrepair scattered throughout the land. The main house, at one time a striking Victorian farmhouse, had badly decayed. Surrounding it were smaller cabins, sheds, and what seemed to be subterranean constructions. The physical decay of the property mirrored the genetic decay of the family, observed forensic psychologist Dr. Robert Harlow. As their bloodline grew increasingly compromised, so too did their environment and their hold on any appearance of normal human conduct. It was into this nightmare that Cordelia Johnson unintentionally stepped in October 1967, accepting a ride from James Thornhill. He had been dispatched to town to get supplies, and, as detectives would later uncover, to find fresh genetic material for the deteriorating family line. The inquiry into the Thornhill clan swiftly broadened past the local sheriff's office once the horrific extent of their offenses became clear. By October 18, 1967, the Texas Rangers and FBI had formed a combined task force, transforming an abandoned school building in nearby Henderson into a command hub for what would become one of the most disturbing criminal probes in American history. "We need everyone to stay composed and professional," directed Texas Ranger Captain Harold Mitchum in the first briefing. "What we're confronting here will challenge the fortitude of even the most experienced law enforcement officer. Keep in mind, our task is to gather proof, find victims, and construct a case that guarantees these individuals never see freedom again." The methodical exploration of the Thornhill property revealed proof more horrifying than initially thought. Behind the main house, investigators came across a smokehouse that contained human remains at different phases of preparation. Carbon dating would subsequently show that this custom had been ongoing for no less than 4 decades. In a detached building, evidently utilized as a birthing facility, they discovered comprehensive logs of every birth on the land since 1930. Each entry featured clinical descriptions of physical irregularities, an evaluation of viability, and a final classification, keeper or provider. Those designated as providers had no subsequent entries, no notes on education, no work tasks, nothing to suggest they had continued as part of the family. They had simply vanished from the records, consumed by their own relatives. The degree of organization was horrifying, FBI Special Agent Leonard Pierce would later write in his memoir. "This wasn't a random burst of psychotic conduct. This was an organized, multi-generational system with its own internal logic and record-keeping." The hardest part of the probe involved speaking with the surviving Thornhill family members. Numerous displayed clear cognitive deficits from generations of inbreeding. Others exhibited a total moral disconnection that astonished even seasoned interrogators. Matilda Thornhill, age 62, spoke matter-of-factly about the family's customs. "The strong ones live and work. The simple ones return their strength to the family. That's the natural way of things." When presented with photos of children who had vanished, she exhibited no emotional response, merely commenting on whether they would have made good stew. Investigators were especially interested in Silas Thornhill Jr., 47, who seemed to have taken over leadership of the family in recent years. Unlike many family members, Silas displayed no clear physical signs of genetic conditions and possessed a disquieting intellectual sharpness. Taught by his grandfather using books collected over many years, Silas had formulated a pseudoscientific justification for the family's actions. "Your society squanders resources on the weak," he told investigators during his third interview. "We grasped efficiency long before your scientists. When the vessel is flawed, the essence must be retrieved and reused. The flesh returns to fortify the bloodline." Among the most disturbing finds was a handwritten manual titled The Preparation of Providers. It detailed methods for identifying which children would be designated as food sources, how they should be raised until harvest, and provided thorough instructions for slaughtering and preparing human flesh in numerous ways. Forensic analysis suggested this document had been revised and enlarged over at least 3 generations. The probe took an unforeseen turn when investigators started examining the family's extensive records. Among birth logs and simple genetic charts, they discovered documentation of occasional introductions, instances where people from outside were brought into the family. These were not mere kidnappings, they signified calculated efforts to bring in fresh genetic material into the increasingly compromised Thornhill bloodline. They grasped on some rudimentary level that their inbreeding was creating issues, clarified Dr. Elena Simmons, a geneticist consulted by the FBI. But rather than stop their incestuous practices, they would periodically abduct outsiders to temporarily strengthen their gene pool. Records indicated that over the prior 40 years, at minimum 17 individuals had been kidnapped and assimilated into the family through coerced marriage and breeding. Once they had produced children, these outsiders generally disappeared, with family records showing they had been processed like other providers. Leave a comment saying, "This is so disturbing," if you're as shocked as I am by these historical events. Your engagement assists the algorithm in sharing this educational material with others who wish to comprehend these dark chapters of history. The medical and scientific assessment of the surviving Thornhill family members unveiled a devastating array of genetic conditions resulting from generations of incestuous unions. In December 1967, a group headed by Dr. Harrison Wells from Baylor College of Medicine carried out comprehensive exams on the 19 living Thornhills at a secure facility near Dallas. "What we're witnessing here is unprecedented in modern medical literature," Dr. Wells reported. "The cumulative impact of inbreeding coefficients this high has generated genetic complications I've never encountered outside of textbook worst-case scenarios." The Thornhill family's inbreeding had reached levels seldom recorded in human communities. While first-cousin marriages, an inbreeding coefficient of 0.0625, can raise the risk of birth defects by roughly 2 to 3%, the Thornhill family had engaged in much closer incestuous unions across multiple generations, leading to inbreeding coefficients estimated between 0.25 and 0.375, levels that almost assured severe genetic conditions. The medical assessment exposed a pattern of recessive genetic illnesses that grew progressively serious with each generation. Among the younger Thornhills, the 5th and 6th generations, over 80% displayed significant intellectual disability, with IQ measurements ranging from 25 to 65. Several were incapable of speaking in full sentences or performing basic self-care. 11 family members suffered from polydactyly, extra fingers or toes, and 9 had syndactyly, fused digits. These conditions had grown so prevalent in the family that they were regarded as normal. Facial dysmorphism was present in nearly all members, including abnormally close-set eyes, malformed ears, and pronounced prognathism, protruding jaw. 7 members had been born with heart defects, though only those with milder cases had reached adulthood. Perhaps most disturbing was the appearance of novel genetic disorders that the medical team could not categorize based on current literature. 3 of the younger Thornhills displayed a previously undocumented syndrome involving progressive muscular wasting combined with hyperactive metabolic function. Despite muscle deterioration, they stayed constantly hungry and demanded nearly continuous feeding. In effect, they've generated genetic disorders that don't exist in the broader population, clarified Dr. Amelia Richardson, a geneticist consulted on the case. With such a restricted gene pool, recessive mutations that might appear in perhaps 1 in several million people in the general population became virtually inevitable within this family. The medical team found that the Thornhills' practice of eating their own kin had a twisted genetic reasoning behind it. Family records showed that those chosen for processing typically exhibited the most serious manifestations of genetic conditions. By eliminating these individuals from the breeding population, the family was attempting a crude version of eugenics. They were practicing a primitive, horrific form of genetic selection, Dr. Richardson noted. But ironically, by continuing to breed within their restricted family group, they were simultaneously guaranteeing that these genetic problems would not only continue but worsen over time. The scientific investigation of the Thornhill case made a substantial contribution to understanding the outcomes of extreme inbreeding in humans, knowledge that had earlier been confined to theoretical models or observations in lab animals. Multiple academic articles were released based on anonymized data from the case, though the full details stayed classified for decades. Dental exams disclosed another disturbing trend. Numerous family members displayed atypical wear patterns on their teeth, in line with a diet significantly different from standard American eating practices of the era. The dental evidence points to a long-term diet unusually high in certain proteins and low in processed carbohydrates, reported Dr. Lawrence Freeman, a forensic odontologist. The wear patterns match regular consumption of undercooked human flesh. Hair and tissue samples from family members contained elevated levels of particular minerals and compounds linked to cannibalism. This included specific prions that would later assist researchers in better understanding diseases like Kuru, a degenerative neurological condition associated with consuming human brain tissue. Indeed, 3 of the older Thornhill members exhibited signs consistent with early-stage prion disease, such as tremors, ataxia, impaired coordination, and episodes of confusion. This indicated that their cannibalistic customs had persisted long enough to trigger these rare conditions. Blood type analysis of the family revealed another aspect of their isolation. While the general American population exhibits considerable diversity in blood types, 18 of the 19 Thornhills had type O blood, with only 1 member having type A, likely passed down from one of the outsiders forcibly brought into the family decades earlier. The uniformity of blood types is another sign of extreme genetic isolation, Dr. Wells commented. In a typical population sample of this size, we would anticipate seeing all major blood types represented. The legal actions against the Thornhill family started in February 1968, though they were conducted with extraordinary confidentiality. Owing to the disturbing character of the crimes and worries about copycat behavior, Judge William Harrington ordered the courtroom sealed and all records classified. The trial would not be accessible to the public or press, with only essential court staff, chosen law enforcement, and expert witnesses permitted to attend. The specifics of this case are so profoundly disturbing that releasing them to the public would fulfill no constructive purpose, Judge Harrington wrote in his sealing order. The public's right to information must be balanced against possible harm to the community and the dignity of the victims. The prosecution, directed by District Attorney George Whitaker, confronted unique hurdles. How could they present such extreme crimes to a jury without inflicting psychological injury? How would they discover jurors who could stay impartial after listening to such proof? Ultimately, the choice was made to forego a jury trial, with the case instead submitted directly to Judge Harrington in a bench trial. 7 adult Thornhill family members were judged competent to stand trial: Silas Jr., James, Matilda, Ruth, Joseph, Abigail, and Thomas. They encountered charges including murder, kidnapping, false imprisonment, abuse of a corpse, and, in a legal first for Texas, ritualized cannibalism, which was prosecuted under seldom-used statutes dating to the 19th century. The remaining 12 family members were judged incompetent because of severe cognitive impairments from generations of inbreeding. They were placed in secure psychiatric facilities where they would stay for the remainder of their lives, their very existence kept as state secrets. The trial continued for just 9 days, with the prosecution offering overwhelming physical proof, family records, and testimony from law enforcement and scientific specialists. The defense, appointed by the court after no attorneys would willingly represent the Thornhills, mounted little resistance. Their main contention, that isolated groups create their own moral standards that shouldn't be evaluated by mainstream society, received no support from Judge Harrington. On March 3, 1968, all 7 defendants were convicted on all counts. Judge Harrington's voice reportedly shook as he issued his ruling, naming the Thornhill case the most profound corruption of family bonds this court has ever encountered or hopes to encounter again. The punishment was definitive. The 5 male defendants were given death sentences, while the 2 female defendants were given life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The differentiation in sentencing based on gender mirrored the legal norms of the period rather than any variation in guilt. What occurred next stays a topic of dispute and conspiracy theories. Official documents show that Silas Jr., James, Joseph, and Thomas Thornhill were put to death by electric chair at Huntsville Prison on September 12, 1969. However, recently released documents hint that the executions might never have happened. Instead, these documents suggest a secret government initiative that assumed control of the Thornhills for intensive scientific examination, codenamed Project Heritage. This alleged research project sought to comprehend the genetic, psychological, and sociological elements that had generated the Thornhill situation. The scientific importance of examining these individuals surpasses the public demand for conventional justice, says one partially redacted memo linked to a federal agency. The distinctive combination of extreme genetic isolation and abnormal behavioral development offers an unparalleled research opportunity. Whether executed as officially documented or secretly examined in government facilities, the Thornhill defendants effectively vanished from history. The family property was entirely demolished, with all buildings burned down and the ashes interred under tons of soil and concrete. The land was incorporated into a national forest, its precise location purposely hidden on maps. The effect on the law enforcement officers and medical experts engaged in the case was significant. Sheriff Calloway resigned his position 6 months following the trial and relocated to Oregon, where he apparently battled alcoholism and nightmares until his death in 1983. For other officers involved in the first investigation ultimately took their own lives, a statistical anomaly that some attribute to the psychological injury of what they saw. Dr. Harrison Wells, who directed the medical exams, gave up his promising academic career to become a rural family doctor. In a rare interview given shortly before his death in 2002, he alluded to the case without identifying it. There are things humans can do that recalibrate your entire understanding of our species. After witnessing that, I couldn't go on as before. The community of Russ County created its own reaction to the trauma. By silent agreement, the Thornhill case was never publicly addressed. When strangers inquired about the family or the situation, locals claimed ignorance or altered the subject. Schools refrained from teaching local history from this time, and newspaper archives oddly lost all pertinent articles. It was a joint choice to cut out this cancer from our community's memory, explained Reverend Thomas Parker in a 2010 oral history project, ending the silence for the first time. Some horrors are so immense that remembering them achieves nothing but to prolong the darkness. As decades went by, the Thornhill case receded even from classified memory. By the early 2000s, most people with direct understanding had passed away or retired. The sealed records accumulated dust in government archives, their importance overlooked until a standard declassification review in 2018 revealed parts of the case once more. Today, the Thornhill case stands as one of the most extreme illustrations of the perils of genetic isolation and familial mistreatment. While numerous details stay classified, adequate information has surfaced to act as a sobering reminder of humanity's capacity for both biological and moral deterioration when separated from the broader social structure. If you've made it to the conclusion of this disturbing historical narrative, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with others who value learning about these dark chapters of history. Your engagement assists us in continuing to provide educational material about these important, if disturbing, historical events. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can identify our most dedicated viewers.